Yeah, absolutely. So, Daniel, actually, let me ask you this question: How are these metrics different from the OKRs that were introduced in SAFe 5.0, or is that kind of similar to
Well,
where?
so they're kind of similar. So OKRs are more at the enterprise portfolio levels. You have your key objective, results, the big results that you're looking at. And those are kind of, strategic. What are we looking to achieve? How are we achieving it? And how well are we doing in what we set ourselves to achieve, in terms of the mission? You tend to use KPIs at more the portfolio level because you actually have key performance indicators. Say, for instance, what's the health of our portfolio backlog, what's the health of the overall trains, what's the health of the features being delivered, how many story points are we actually iterating continuously, are we seeing opportunities where in the end we're seeing our tech debt reducing but also the opportunity and the learning culture increasing, are
Yeah.
we so many things. So there are different dimensions. Say basically has, I think, 51 different dimensions for metrics and the measure of growth, framework that has just been released. But then also it goes into understanding, the different aspects and the context in which you apply them. You know,
Yeah.
um, key thing to always remember also is that metrics are not a report card and they're not a scoring points. To see who is the weakest link. They're an opportunity to benchmark the need to collect centralized data for an opportunity to have a further conversation, even if it's just one metric you're able to run to
Right.
say, well, guys, we can bring this into the I&A. Let's look at the problem solving workshop. How do we, improve?
So, Daniel, you mentioned it's not a report card, right? So, a question about that was: should metrics be shared with other teams, and how transparent should the results be for that? Is there like a balance to that, or how do you deal with it? What would you suggest to other teams or people who are facilitating all these discussions
Was that for me or for Anand?
for you?
Okay. So transparency is a very delicate issue when it comes to sharing metrics. Ideally, you would want to actually have people either do the assessments, anonymously, but collectively also. But at the same time, also, make sure you have a generic, assessment across all the different teams. But each team also have to have their own assessments, where the Scrum Master is driving those opportunities. Because remember, some of those assessments will bring out some results and some kind of key inputs and outputs as to what needs to improve at the team level. Others would actually be consistent across the team of teams. Say for
Yeah.
instance, there's a tooling need, and everyone is now meant to now pivot to a new tool. It could also even be a technical issue as to, well, we were actually working on a spike, and then that spike resulted into us actually having to can multiple features. you
Yeah.
know so there could be several aspects in which you measure on growth, the ability to adapt to change. So I would always say, try and get the key stakeholders involved, try and get the key parties, the dev managers, dev leads, to understand why you're running a metric assessment, or agile assessment, and also what the inputs and the outputs are, but also ensure that the teams involved are also participating, because participation is very, very important, where there's a self-ownership to say, okay, actually, we think there's an opportunity for us here.
Yeah.
Looking at questions, looking at the conversations, let's go into a deep diving session. Let's discuss exactly how we would now, collaborate. It could also even have you bringing in the customers to participate in some of those, you know,
Right.
allow for, always remember that metrics serve as a benchmark for a further conversation to improve your agility towards a future outcome.
So, Anand, I'm going to kind of segue into another question from what just Daniel talked about. What are some do's and don'ts that you recommend for us for starting a measuring growth strategy for a new org versus a mature agile org? And maybe let's combine another question we had earlier from someone. Is so a lot of teams, especially starting up, right? They do these metrics, and then people start measuring them or their performance against these metrics. That's one. And then second, ana patterns, I guess, at least from what I've seen, is leadership, especially getting like who are new to agile, start comparing one team to another team based on their metrics, right? So what would be some do's and don'ts? What would your recommendation be for the leadership here?
So it's a large question. So I'll kind of step back and
Yeah.
answer one. Um, so this is something that I'd like to kind of point out is that um, metrics have to be completely transparent, and you should not give there should be no need to give any context to those numbers, right? And if you feel even when I say that, if you can feel anxiety rise in your heart, then it means that there's something a little foundational you have to take care of before you can even start getting into the metrics game. Okay,
Right.
if you feel like you have to be the person who shows it to your leadership and you cannot let them just go see the report on their own, then that's something you have to sort of take care of before you start creating some sort of a metric strategy.
So, yeah, I think that was a really good point by Anand, that there should be transparency. At least from what I've seen in the past, is some people just try to rig the matrix so that they can be transparent. So that another anti-pattern. Go ahead, Anand.
So I'll say this, right? So in my career, having done this for a little bit, the metrics, I've had most success with metrics when my senior most leader, who was sponsoring the transformation, was willing to not react to positive or negative metrics, perceived positive or negative
Yeah.
metrics.
Mhm.
Metrics, and there's this notion that you shouldn't compare teams against each other. That's not true at all. You obviously have to compare teams against each other, and the idea is that you compare them in a healthy way, and that you can learn from each other. If a team has better velocity stability, if they have better commit versus complete, the idea is to learn from them what they're doing differently, or what is it that they're doing, period.
Right.
But comparison is sort of a negative word, I guess, in that if people are not having that secondary conversation to learn from a Rahul's team or learn from a Dan's team, then what's the point, right? What's the point of measuring? What's the point of being transparent if nobody's going to look at anybody else's data? If nobody's going to ask the probing questions,
So I
right?
guess to that point, Anand, my question is, like, a lot of people face that challenge, right?
Mhm.
Especially going new and not having a good like support from leadership. How do you influence leadership, or how do you coach leadership at that point, saying the metrics are not really performance of the team, like the quality of the work, etc., and not take the metrics in the wrong way?
Right. So I mean, I would say it's 70% on the leadership, 30% on the coaches who are going there to coach them, right?
Yeah.
So I hate to sound like a broken record, but it really comes back to what is the goal of the transformation, right? And I tell people all the time, I am not here to implement SAFe. I could really care less about SAFe, the levels and the roles and what they call it, right? It's a great framework. It's there for a reason. It works. But ultimately, what I want is good agility, design, iterative delivery, and happy customers. I'm just using SAFe as a vehicle to get us there, right?
Yeah.
And you don't have to do everything SAFe says to have a successful, scaled, agile organization. SAFe
Right.
has figured out one way of doing it, right? And so when you go in and have these kind of transparent conversations with leadership, they tend to trust you more, and you can really sit down with them and figure out what is good. And a lot of times what you'll realize is that they don't have a great clear picture of what good looks like. They just know they don't like where they are today, right?
Absolutely.
And that's good enough. So then you can kind of help them and say, how about we go over there? How about we go to a world where we have at least 2.5 weeks of refined stories, and about 80% of commit versus complete, and about an 80-90% velocity stability in all the teams. Let's see what that looks like. Can you help me get us there? I don't know what outcome it's going to bring, but will you be okay with me taking us over there? So now you have some very clear coaching goals to coach, right? And then you can kind of move there. 90 days, you probably get you there. And then you can say, okay, we're great at team level. Now I want us to focus on PI level, like train level planning goals.
Yeah.
And then slowly kind of scale up. Even the transformation, you can start piece by piece and scale up. Because if you do it this way, it'll be slow, but it'll be certain. You won't have any rollbacks. After 6 months, everybody rolls back out of Agile. You won't have that problem if you do it step by step, and you kind of bring people along for the journey. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that I think you mentioned a lot of great points about how to coach your leadership, and 70% relies on the leadership to kind of support your people, right? Now, Daniel, I'm going to ask you, like, have you experienced something like that in the past, or do you know teams who have experienced where leadership was not fully on board with Agile, and they just want to do certain things like very differently than how Agile kind of
it is always the case in any agile transformation. Remember also, within any traditional waterfall moving or pivoting into agile, you likely have roles such as project managers, you have roles that basically have not been scrum masters, you have roles that also have never really worked in an agile way. They're used to time and material or fixed price budgets, and projects, and then you're now trying to tell them to actually, pivot into agile without actually educating them or guiding them as to what, it means to be agile and to do agile. And so I have seen that, I have also seen, scenarios where the results of the assessments meant, the organization at the enterprise level had to make some hardcore decisions because the conversations were unhealthy, so we had to have, a transformation from the organizational approach in terms of, okay, well, these roles are actually not doing anything here, but we need basically these roles to fulfill this function, and this in the transformation.
Right.
Yes.
So thank you, Daniel, for that. All right. Last question for our podcast, and that is from Marcel. In my company, there's a practice to use team level estimations for bidding. The issue is that the teams were asked to point according to the time, and many people who have worked in agile environments see that as a problem. So I think she's talking more about bidding for contracts, right? So I guess leadership is asking teams to put estimations and how much time it's going to take, I guess. Is that right, Marcel? For the whole project. And then they do story points based on how much time the story is going to take or a feature is going to take. So in that situation, her question is, how can I support that mind shift from using team level estimations for bidding? What are industry best practices, and how to detach time versus effort? Anand, do you have any pointers for her?